They rose from the mountains of Anatolia, a people once dismissed as shadows at the edge of Mesopotamia. Yet, within centuries, the Hittite built an empire so vast, so relentless, it challenged Egypt itself. Their armies marched with iron weapons before others even dreamed of forging them. Their chariots roared like thunders across the plains. Their kings carved laws in stone, brokered treaties with pharaohs, and raised temples where gods of storm and sun were worshipped in fire and blood. For almost 2,000 years, their capital at Hattusa stood as fortress of stone, ringed with walls filled with archives, a beating heart of power and ambition. From Babylon to the Levant, rulers feared the seal of Hittite kings. They were not a footnote to history, they were its authors. And then absolute silence. Around 1200 BCE, their palaces burned. The great halls of Hattusa fell silent. The scribes who once filled libraries with thousands of clay tablets vanished without a word. Their gods were abandoned, their monuments swallowed by forest and earth. How does a superpower vanish almost overnight? Was it drought that broke their crops, rebellion from within, or the mysterious invaders known only as the Sea People? And we all know that the Hittites, once rivaled to Egypt and masters of diplomacy and war, disappeared, leaving behind little more than broken walls and whispers in the forgotten texts. Today on CTT-Stories, we bring their forgotten empires back to life. The rise, the glory, and the sudden fall of the Hittites, the shadow superpower of the ancient world. The Hittites began as the whisper in the highlands, scattered clans in central Anatolia, hidden among rocky ridges, oak forest, and river that cut deep into the earth. Their world was harsh. Winters bit cold, summers baked the soil, and survival depended on resilience. Yet, from this rugged land, something unexpected was taking shape. In the 17th century BC, their scattered tribes began to unify under powerful kings. Chiefs who once fought for pasture now bent knees to a single throne. That throne was placed in Hattusa, a city carved into the mountains. Its massive walls stretching nearly 4 miles, studded with gates shaped like lions, sphinx, and warriors. It was a fortress of stone and ambition, designed to keep enemies out and to remind the world that the Hittites had arrived. Inside its walls, the Hittites built not only palaces but vast archives. Thousands of clay tablets recorded laws, treaties, myth, and omens. They absorbed the cuneiform script from Mesopotamia and gave it their own voice. Their priests brought in gods from every land they touched. Storm gods from Anatolia, sun deities from Syria, war gods from Mesopotamia, until their phantoms swelled to hundreds. In this fusion of faith and power, the Hittites found their identity, a people who took the best of the world and made it their own. Their warriors, too, were quick learners as well. From their Hurrian neighbors, they mastered the art of chariot warfare, but they improved it, building it lighter, faster chariots that could carry 3 men instead of 2. A driver, a shield bearer, and a warrior armed with spears and bow. With these machines of war, their armies became swift and terrifying at the same time. And then came their greatest secret: iron. While most of the world still fought with bronze, the Hittites began forging tools and weapons from this stronger metal. An iron blade could cut through bronze like bark. With it, they had a weapon not just for war, but for destiny. Their rise was meteoric. But by the mid-1600s BCE, Hittite kings sent their armies south and shocked the entire world. They swept into Mesopotamia, stormed Babylon itself, and burned the ancient cities. For centuries, Babylon had been the joy of the Near East, its king unchallenged, but now its throne was shattered. And the name of the Hittites was carved in fear across every palace. From there, they expanded into Syria, clashing with kingdoms and absorbing land rich in trade and resources. Grain, copper, silver, and timber flowed into their hands. They stood astride the crossroad of east and west, ruling lands that stretched from the Aegean coast to the bank of the Euphrates. In less than 2 centuries, the Hittites had risen from mountain tribes to master of a superpower. They were no longer forgotten highlanders. They were kings who could challenge pharaohs, scribes who could command the gods, and warriors who could topple empire. The forgotten shadows of Anatolia had become a force the world could not ignore anymore. By the 14th century BC, the Hittites had carved themselves into history's stage as one of the greatest empires of the ancient world. Their capital, Hattusa, was not just a fortress anymore. It was a city of power, filled with temples to stone gods and halls where kings sat on thrones of stone. Its archives stored thousands of clay tablets, preserving everything from laws and prayers to treaties and letters exchanged with pharaohs. The Hittites ruled with both iron and ink. They were feared warriors, but also skilled diplomats. Their kings sent envoys to Babylon, Assyria, and Egypt, addressing their rivals not as enemies but as brothers. It was a rare fraternity of rulers where power was measured not just in soldiers but in words and seals stamped into clay. Their armies were unmatched. The Hittite chariot was the pride of their army, built lighter and faster than those of their rivals. Unlike the Egyptian 2-man chariot, the Hittite version carried 3: a driver, a shield bearer, and a warrior ready to strike. These mobile fortresses dominated the battlefield, turning plains into storm of wood, bronze, and iron. And then came the greatest test of their strength, the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE. On the plains of Syria, the Hittites faced the most powerful man in the world, Pharaoh Ramses II. The clash was colossal. Tens of thousands of soldiers, chariots thundering like earthquakes, spears raining down. At first, the Hittites struck hard, surrounding the Egyptian and nearly annihilating Ramses' forces. But the Egyptian rallied, turning the tide in a desperate struggle that ended in stalemate. Neither side won the field, but what followed was unprecedented. Instead of endless war, the Hittites and the Egyptian crafted the world's first known peace treaty, written in Akkadian on clay and silver tablets. It declared the two empires as equal and bound them against common enemies. It was diplomacy at its highest, a recognition that even superpowers sometimes must share the stage. For a time, the Hittites flourished. Their reach extended from Anatolia to Syria, from the Aegean to the edge of the Mesopotamia. They controlled vital trade routes, taxing merchants who carried tin, copper, silver, and grain across the Near East. Their scribes recorded every exchange. Their priests conducted elaborate ceremonies to honor the gods, and their kings married into foreign dynasties to strengthen their grip. To their people, it seemed as though the empire was eternal. The Hittites had risen from forgotten tribes to rulers of a superpower, standing shoulder to shoulder with Egypt, writing their names into the laws, treaties, and legends of the ancient world. But even in the Golden Age, shadows were lightening, because the same storm that lifted the Hittites to greatness would one day turn against them. For centuries, the Hittites had seemed unstoppable. Iron in their hand, treaties at their command, armies thundering across the plain. But greatness carries a price, and in the end, the price was more than even they could pay. The Anatolia plateau, where they built their empire, was never an easy land. Rainfall was uncertain, the soil thin, and harvest fragile. In good years, canals and traces kept the field alive. In bad years, famine walked the road. By the late 13th century BCE, bad years became very common. Clay tablets from Hattusa revealed prayers, rituals, and desperate words to the storm gods. Plea for rain, offering of cattle and grain, and even human life sacrificed to restore the balance. But the skies gave nothing. Fields cracked, reservoirs dried, and whispers of hunger turned to open fear. In the markets of Hattusa, families clutched empty baskets. Farmers abandoned parched land and fled towards the coast. Children grew thin, priests raised their arms to the heavens. But the god remained silent. Inside the royal court, stability collapsed as quickly as the harvest. Succession dispute poisoned the throne. Brothers plotted against brothers, son against fathers, each grasping for power in a kingdom already trembling. Each civil struggle tore the empire's fabric thinner, draining soldiers from the frontier and breaking the unity that once held them together. Their enemies saw weakness and closed in. The Assyrians pressed from the east with disciplined armies, eager to claim their lost land. In the west, tribes stirred relentlessly, testing Hittite borders with raids. But worse than all came the wave from the sea, the mysterious sea people, whose very name echoes like a warning through the history. They moved like storms across Mediterranean, touching cities, breaking kingdoms, and toppling thrones. To Egypt, they were invaders. To the Hittites, they were the final blow. Archaeology tells us what the scripts no longer could. Around 1200 BCE, fire consumed Hattusa. Its walls crumbled under the heat of invasion or rebellion. The once proud palaces, with their lion-gated entrances, were reduced to smoking rubble. Thousands of clay tablets, the very memory of an empire, hardened into ash and shards. The scribes who once carved treaties with pharaohs put down their stylus forever. Ordinary lives ended in silence. Families fled with what little they could carry. Basket of grain, clay gods, tools of iron. Some never returned. Others left their bones burned in abandoned houses. Discovery by archaeologists thousands of years later. The temple stood empty. The gods were left without worshippers. And then came the greatest silence of all. History forgot them. For centuries afterwards, no one even remembered the name Hittite. Unlike Egypt or Babylon, who lived on in memory and myth, the Hittites vanished so completely that later civilizations believed that they had never existed. Only broken ruins in the highlands, swallowed by forest, bore witness to what had once been one of the greatest power of the ancient world. The ruins of Hattusa whisper only silence. But scholars have spent decades trying to uncover what destroyed Hittite Empire. The truth, it seems, was not one single blow, but a perfect storm of disasters. Climate change and famine stand at the center of the story. Studies of ancient tree rings and sediments suggest a cycle of drought struck Anatolia in the 13th and 12th century BCE. Crops withered, rivers ran shallow, and entire harvest failed. For a kingdom already living on fragile farmland, famine was a weapon sharper than any sword. Clay tablets from the final years of Hattusa speak of prayers, rituals, and sacrifices, desperate attempts to bring rain. But the skies gave nothing. At the same time, internal strife gone at the empire's strength. Succession dispute weakened the royal line as prince and factions fought for control. Without stability at the throne, generals, governors, and the vassals pulled away, fracturing the empire's unity. A power built on loyalty and tribute began to crumble when those loyalties broke. And then came the enemies at the gate. The Assyrians pressed relentlessly from the east, eager to seize trade routes. The western frontier strained against restless strife, but the most feared were the mysterious sea people, invaders who swept across Mediterranean like locusts, torching cities with Anatolia to Levant. They are remembered only in Egyptian inscription, but their impact was felt everywhere. Did they storm Hattusa itself, or did their raid simply push the fragile kingdom over the edge? We cannot know. Finally, there is the psychological collapse. The Hittites worshipped 1,000 gods, each tied to the land, to the weather, the harvest. When the rain stopped and famine deepened, people began to doubt their rulers and their gods. Rituals that once promised order failed. Faith, the invisible glue that bound the empires together, fractured. And once belief in the divine order vanished, so too did the will to fight for it. The fall of the Hittites was not unique. Around 1200 BCE, the entire eastern Mediterranean burned. Mycenaean Greece fell into darkness. Cities in the Levant crumbled. Egypt itself staggered but barely survived. It was the late Bronze Age collapse, a storm of destruction that erased entire civilization. The Hittites were not alone, but their disappearance was absolute. And perhaps this is the most haunting truth. Not just that they fell, but that they were forgotten. Egypt lived on in memory, Babylon in myth, but the Hittites vanished so completely that for 3,000 years their name was erased from history. Only in the 19th century, when archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Hattusa and the strange language of their tablets, did the forgotten empire rise again? Not in power, but in memory. The fall of the Hittites is more than an old tale of kings and battles. It is a reminder that even the greatest powers can vanish, not with a roar, but with a silence. They stood equal to Egypt and Babylon, signed the world's first peace treaty, forged iron blades before anyone else, and ruled a realm that stretched across continents. Yet, within a single lifetime, their palaces burned, their gods were abandoned, and their name was erased from memory. Their story teaches us that power is fragile, built not only on armies and monuments, but on food, faith, and unity. When harvests fail, when trust crumbles, when belief in the system breaks, even the strongest walls cannot hold. The Hittites reminds us that collapse is rarely a single moment. It is a chain of failures, each feeding the next, until the whole structure crumbles. And yet their story also speaks of resilience. Forgotten for 3,000 years, their name was revived again by archaeologists who unearthed their tablets and unlocked their lost languages. Today, the Hittites live again, not as rulers but as voices in our shared human story. In the end, the ruins of Hattusa do not only tell of destruction, they whisper a question to us. What will survive of our own empires? What will future generations remember of us? Our triumph, our failures, or perhaps nothing at all. The Hittites, the forgotten superpower of the Bronze Age, reminds us that history is not written only by the victors. It is also written in the silence of those who are gone. Thank you for journeying with us into the silence of the Hittite Empire. This story reminds us that even the greatest powers can vanish, leaving only ruins and whispers behind. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more cinematic history. Drop the phrase "forgotten power" in the comments to let us know you are listening to the echoes of the past. Until next time, stay curious, stay respectful, and remember, history that still echoes. And I'll see you in the next one.